All right, I want to offer a very short lecture on a subject called positivism. It's an ism, a late 19th century ideology that is important because it is sort of the underlying ideology of the Ctypicals, who provide the underlying ideology for the Porfiriato, actually. In a very broad sense, a definition of positivism might be a theory that theology and metaphysics are historically earlier and imperfect modes of knowledge, and that positive knowledge, true knowledge, is based on natural phenomena and their properties and relations as verified by the empirical sciences. It's an affirmation in rational thinking. And as I said, it became in some ways the scientific, putting air quotes around scientific, justification for authoritarian politics in Latin America, especially in Porfirian Mexico. Now, before we get to Mexico, let's talk about the origins of positivism, which reside with Auguste Compt, a Frenchman, lived in the first half of the 19th century, and he just as Adam Smith essentially invented economics, Freud, psychology, Compt is generally considered the father of sociology. He's sort of the inventor of the sociological field and is in some ways greatly respected. But he was also intermittently insane and is also sort of made fun of. It's kind of respected but also mocked, not unlike sociology. Now, he was focused on modernity. He was living in a world that revered human reason. And there's a relation here to atheism, this idea that now that enlightenment is here, what we know is based on the matter and energy present in the universe. There is nothing beyond that, nothing transcendent. And so we look at what we know is energy and matter and what we rationalize in our mind about that. That's all we can know. And he called this positivism. And he first espoused in a series of writings between 1830 and 1842. Now, Comte proposed sort of three stages of historical development. He said society, mankind lives in three stages. This idea of putting it in stages, not unlike Marxism, that's not surprising. He and Marx were contemporaries, and they both looked to Henri de Saint-Simon, who was a utopian socialist thinker who influenced both Marx and Comte. He was also Comte's mentor. Anyway, so we had these three stages. Stage one was the theological stage, which is based on a wholehearted belief in all things with reference to God and deals with humankind's accepting of church doctrine rather than relying on its rational powers to explore the basic questions of existence. Stage two is the metaphysical stage. Metaphysics, by the way, is that part of philosophy that is concerned with the basic cause and nature of things. This is not necessarily appropriate, but it might help you see it. It's sort of thinking spiritually about the world, but not necessarily religiously. This phase is the phase in which the universal rights of humanity are very important. This is the rights of man idea, that humanity is invested with certain inalienable rights that must be respected. This is what drove the French Revolution. Metaphysical thinking, however, disregards belief in a concrete God. The third stage is known as the positivity stage, or the positive stage, also known as the scientific stage. And it refers to scientific explanation based on observation, experiment, and comparison. Positive explanations rely upon the scientific method for their justification. During this stage, humans try to establish cause and effect relationships. Positivism is a purely intellectual way of looking at the world. As well, it emphasizes observation and classification of data and facts. And this is sort of the basis of positivism as Comte espoused it. Now, a tangent here. Later in his life, Comte invented a religion of humanity. He said that now we don't need religion anymore. We've done away with religion and God. We still need the trappings of religion, the communal aspect, the ritual aspect. And I think he was probably right. And so he invented a whole elaborate religion called the Religion of Humanity, laid it out in 2 volumes, Summary Exposition of the Universal Religion, and Theory of the Future of Man. He even proposed his scheme called for a plan for an enormous new priesthood, which would employ 100,000 people in France alone, part philosopher, part writer, part psychotherapist. I think it'd be a really cool job. But anyway, he was laughed at for this idea, and this is one reason he's sort of looked at askance now. All right, at some point, Auguste Compt's ideas of positivism somehow got conflated with social Darwinism. You'll recall Herbert Spencer was the premier social Darwinist of Britain, and he was a student of Compt, and he sort of put the two together. Difficult to say how. I guess, according to social Darwinists and the rising tide of racism in the 19th century, racism had a certain scientific logic to it. And so he sort of conflated positivism with social Darwinism and racism, and this got translated into an ideology for how you build a country, and that got applied to Latin America. All right, so a Mexican positivism emerged, and that was the leading ideology of the Científicos, the scientists, literal word in Spanish, or really those scientifically oriented. And this Mexican positivism was part positivism, part scientific management, part social Darwinism, and part just naked, unfettered capitalism. And it was largely a group of technocrats, and by technocrats I mean technical experts like engineers, bankers, and economists who were in government for their technical expertise as opposed to political reasons. They were members of a group, a coherent group, who advanced Mexican progress. They believed in the following: order and progress fused together. They demanded a direct control by an elite in a state geared toward progress. Demonstrable empirical science would determine truth and develop laws. This was considered a cure for disorder, particularly the disorder of Mexico prior to the Porfiriato. There was an emphasis on education, but really only elite education, and this was inherently racist, i.e., the biggest problem Mexico had was the fact that the vast majority of its population were part Indian, and they were racially inferior to the kind of economic progress that we wanted. The Científicos, by the way, they're not just a theory. They were an actual definable group of people who considered themselves Científicos. We've already mentioned Limantour, Jose Yves Limantour, who was the Secretary of the Treasury from 1893 until 1911 with the fall of Diaz. He was considered sort of the political leader of the faction of Científicos. Enrique Creel, 1854 to 1931. He was a wealthy businessman and landowner. He was an influential member of the powerful Creel-Terrazas family that I've mentioned that dominated the northern state of Chihuahua. Huge landholders, millions of acres. And he was the governor of Chihuahua from 1904 until the fall of the Diaz regime in 1911. And finally, Luis Terrazas, 1829 to 1923. He was the founder he was the patriarch of the Creel-Terrazas family. He was the father-in-law of Enrique Creel and one of the richest landowners in the Republic of Mexico. He helped bankroll the Científico faction. And so, in conclusion, positivism as the ideology of the Científicos was important. It played a significant role in the revolution because if we go to our analytical formula of the revolution is caused by old inequalities plus new economic pressures, old inequalities equal the racism and the racial classes, social classes inherent in old Mexico, and certainly positivism gave that sort of a scientific veneer. And then we discussed the new economic pressures, growth, which positivism was incredibly pro-growth, and it was dependent on foreign investment, which exacerbated threats to Mexican sovereignty, and it exacerbated stratification of wealth, which of course was the principal economic pressure that exploded the old inequalities resulting in the revolution.